Professor Podcast, the podcast of your professors, their research, and their academic lives here at St. Thomas. This week, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Amy Nygaard, an assistant professor of art history and director of museum studies. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
So to begin, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how that eventually led you to today's topic?
Sure. So my background in art history is kind of a meandering one. So I'll fast forward to the shortcut here is that when I was setting out to do my doctoral work, I was thinking about contemporary grotesque. My doctoral advisor, Frances Connolly, that was her wheelhouse. She wrote quite a bit on the grotesque in the Western tradition. And that really lined up with my interest in contemporary African art and arts of the African diaspora. So when I was picking my topic for my dissertation, my intent was to look at contemporary artists in Africa, particularly female artists, that work was exploring aspects of the grotesque, so abject imagery, monstrous imagery, fragmented bodies, these things. And so I was compiling a list of artists that I loved, and I had written a bit about this really fantastic artist. She's from Kenya. It's now, I believe, a citizen of the U.S., Wangishi Mutu. Her work is fantastic. And I was really interested in working on her. But then when I started compiling my list of artists, I saw that quite a few of them were from South Africa. So I was like, what is going on with South Africa and the grotesque? Like, why are so many contemporary, so contemporary roughly means like 1980s to today. Why are so many contemporary artists in South Africa kind of engaged in this very particular aesthetic? And that sent me down a wormhole of what's up with South Africa? Like, what's going on here? And then I got into thinking about the kind of the correlation of political violence and unrest and the use of this grotesque aesthetic. And then my world just kind of, my research world kind of blew up when I came across Jane Alexander's Butcher Boys. It's a really evocative work, kind of, I think most people who see it for the first time, usually when I show my students for the first time in class, some of them like giggle or kind of recoil at the sight. They all have kind of various, kind of extreme reactions to it. Actually, the first time I saw it, I was really kind of moved by it, and I felt sorry for them. I felt really kind of this empathic, like, oh no, what happened to these people? But that kind of says more about me and my caretaking instinct. But nevertheless, the idea that it evokes different reactions from everyone is an interesting part of the art. But really what struck me as so remarkable about the work is, beyond the aesthetic, it was that it was the centerpiece of the National Gallery in South Africa. And like, I could not compute how a National Gallery would choose this really kind of overtly grotesque, really kind of difficult to look at sculptural work as the centerpiece of a National Gallery. And so everything I knew about museums at this point it wasn't surface, but it was, I hadn't really gotten deep into kind of the history and theory of museums yet. I was still very much focusing on this kind of post-colonial grotesque aesthetic. But I was just captured and stuck on this, like, why this? Why this work as a centerpiece of a National Gallery? Particularly in the South African context. They had such really remarkable and kind of apt, I don't want to say heroic, but I mean, kind of heroic figures in Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu. Like, any of these figures could like a portrait of them, or some type of reification of like the Rainbow Nation, something really uplifting and impactful. Usually those are the types of imagery you see in a National Gallery. Usually National Galleries want to represent the great ideals of their country, not necessarily their difficult past, particularly very recent past. So I was like, oh, that's something. That's something really interesting. And so that's how I got into the area that I'm kind of currently moving out of it. But I started to think about, oh, well, maybe this move by the National Gallery in South Africa was actually a really intentional move to kind of subvert this idea of kind of heroic national identity moving forward in this new democracy. And maybe it's a really kind of people-centered move around facing the past, facing a very difficult past, and perhaps creating a space or a catalyst for some type of at least conversations to be had within the museum, potentially space where people could get some sort of catharsis out of having their experiences acknowledged, represented in such a powerful, legitimizing place that museums are. Museums really confer power. They legitimize stories. So that's where I got into then the museum aspect of it. I was like, oh yeah, these museums, they have a real potential of they could use their power for good, so, which is historically they have not been doing, using their power for good. So I was really inspired by that example. Yeah.
And you talked about South Africa and the things that have happened in
Yeah.
the very recent past in South Africa. And what I find interesting is that in this specific instance, the past is very apparent and ugly. And I know in my experience, in American history, experiences I've had, people do have a tendency to take very horrific past experiences and make them look less ugly. You're still acknowledging that they're there,
Right.
but you're not making them grotesque.
Right. Yeah.
Why do you think that a South African museum would choose to display the past in a grotesque way rather than just acknowledging that it's there? Why are they making it ugly?
Right.
It is ugly,
Yeah,
but why do they want that to be obvious?
I think there's some like truth telling in that. There's great liberty and symbolism in the grotesque that it defies categories of self and other. So it kind of operates in a zone that kind of always slips away from power. So if you can relate to feeling troubled or harmed, or as if violence has been physically or emotionally committed to you. So seeing that type of, seeing that visualized can be really evocative. And yes, it might be ugly, but think about if everything's always beautiful, do you always feel happy and beautiful? So there's something really powerful and legitimizing and affirming about seeing the cracks, right? Seeing that maybe you're not the only person who has been wounded or hurt in some way. So there's a lot of power in revealing that and honoring that and not trying to, put the makeup over it of just being kind of the warts and all of it. And I think that, yeah, it can be, certainly people don't like to look at it, right? People don't like to concentrate on it much. And I don't know if I can really speak to why people don't want to face that. I love to face it. I love to feel validated in the messiness of life and the imperfections and all of that. I think it's really affirming, and I think you can find actually like great beauty in that as well, I think, in the grotesque. But historically, the grotesque has been used as kind of a weapon that appears in societies in which something, you're pushed out to like the margins of society. You're made to feel excluded. So this is a way for those people or groups or cultural practices that are usually trying to be suppressed or pushed aside or made into like a subculture or something outside. Usually it's from those groups that are speaking back. And so it is a kind of a powerful weapon of thinking about the tradition in like Western art of classical beauty, right? Like the classical Greek beauty, Greco-Roman beauty, of that being the standard, right? That we all have to conform to or look to or aspire to. And that at surface is okay. It's fine to have these kind of aspirational goals, but when it is weaponized as if you're not this, then you're lesser, that's when it becomes an issue, right? That's when we weaponize these ideas of beauty and physical appearance, these surface level things, as opposed to acknowledging that no, we all have, our bodies will always betray us, right? They are asymmetrical, goofy, weird, oozing things that we can't control. And there's a real kind of humbling aspect of acknowledging that this is just one part of us that we actually cannot control it. And we don't have much say over our appearance and what we look like. And so this idea of taking the grotesque and representing it, affirming it, using it as some type of declarative of like, I am here, and if you look at this, you'll actually see yourself reflected in it in some way. So it also has the potential of like dissolving these hard binaries. At least in the realm of aesthetics, that's typically how it goes. It's kind of a shapeshifter. Like whenever you you think you can describe what it is, then it might be something different. And so if you think about how we cling to identities, how we cling to, I am this, or I am this thing, I am subject, right? Well, you're not always that, right? If you cling too hard to it, you'll soon find that it escapes, right? We don't have this singular vision. We aren't these singular things. We are fluid in all sorts of different ways. And that fluidity, that movement, is also a part of the grotesque.
And in the context of South Africa, where the racial minority, white Europeans, was oppressing the racial majority, which were South Africans, the true South Africans, has this been a recent, I guess I would say, trend or pattern in South African museums where they want the grotesque to be apparent? And historically, has it not even been available or an option to represent those viewpoints that were oppressed?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. No. So this is a very new, I would say it's a contemporary thing. For me, Jane Alexander was the first time, in a national museum, that I had seen something that was so overtly grotesque and took prime real estate. So when you open up the doors to the National Gallery, they are right there. You can't avoid them. There's one way into this building and one way out. So as soon as you open the door, you see them. And that matters. Like what you think about real estate, right? Location matters. So usually, logic follows that you're going to put the thing that you really think people should see you're going to put that as the first thing that they see, that they can't avoid, right? So it's right there. That was an exception, and I think it still is an exception. But historically, no, the grotesque is not. No, it is not included in South African museums, or I would even say Western museums. But here's the kind of the thing about museums are that they are this European, Western European colonial institutions that came out of the Enlightenment and really served to legitimize empire and demonstrate difference and justify colonialism as well. So the structures, the ideology of that does not change when you take those museums and you put them in a South African context. So the National Gallery, the South African Museum, which is their their natural history museum, those were built in the mid-1800s by white Europeans who are living in South Africa. So primarily, it actually wasn't necessarily the Afrikaners. It was primarily the British who were in South Africa, for the most part. There are exceptions here, but who were starting these institutions, and then they would have curators and fellows and these different societies, anthropological societies, who are making the collections and installing them in the way in which museums have collected and displayed in European capitals. So like in London and Paris and Leiden, they're just copying those same things. So it's not remarkable that in South Africa, those museums are kind of a mirror image of the Europeans' museums because they were the ones that's the cookie cutter, like that's it, that's what a museum is. But now in the in the post-apartheid context, their government, after the fall of apartheid, they had a transitional government, and this is when you get like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of airing, testifying, recording, having these public hearings about the atrocities that took place during the apartheid. And so a lot of the emphasis on building the new government was about reconciliation, was about hearing the testimonies of all of the horrific things that had happened, but then also with this kind of understanding that we're going to go through this process of reconciliation in the hopes that we're going to lay the past to rest. So this also lines up with a lot of trauma theory and trauma study about how you make progress in recovery, like trauma recovery. How you make progress is that you have to get into the history first. You have to kind of go back and see what's there and testify to it and have it heard and have it acknowledged, but then also have action. Okay, and that's the critical part that I think a lot of museums, a lot of nations, we like to acknowledge, maybe somewhat investigate the past, maybe, but the action element is sometimes not necessarily the strongest part. They think that as long as we acknowledge it, like, yeah, that happened, let's move on. That's usually, in my, I guess, somewhat cynical observation, that's kind of how it goes. But there needs to be an action orient. So in South Africa, they chose restorative justice over punitive justice. So people were, if you attested to your crimes that you committed during the apartheid, if you were found to be telling a full and truthful account of the things that you were done, you could get amnesty. And so the element of punitive justice, for the most part, was taken off the table. Now, some people did end up getting criminal sentences, but they opted for this idea of reconciliation, restorative justice as a way to heal the nation. So now, some of the actions have, we can really think critically about how that Truth and Reconciliation Commission functioned. Was it really effective? I'm not South African. I've not lived under that, but the research and the writing about it is kind of highly critical, because a lot of the economic restitution, all of these things, that hasn't been taken up so much. However, in the cultural realm, maybe reforming museums is not the right word, but there was, and I was just there last summer, a really remarkable step forward in the museums. And I think in the ways in which they're addressing the white supremacy of the past, the legacy of that, telling much more truthful histories of their people, the complexities of this history. New people have positions of power in these museums. So in that way, if we judge it by that, I feel like there has been really kind of significant change. Now, the daily lives of people, just living day to day, that's a whole different thing. And I'm not your scholar for that discussion. So that important element, I think that I want to be optimistic in this light, of thinking that they have made progress in the museums of investigating the past, seeing, truthfully kind of speaking to what had happened, what continues to happen, how that affects people, how that affects these cultural institutions, and then making it better, changing the ways in which those museums operate, the ways in which they tell the stories, who's being collected, all of these things. I think that they're doing a pretty great job. Yeah.
Why is it so important that museums kind of change their approach to the past? Is it just because so many people visit museums, or because they get publicity? What's the greater impact of changing a museum so it's more trauma-informed and more, I don't know, I guess I would say trauma-informed and maybe just self-aware about what the past is and what they're presenting?
Yeah, I love that. Another fantastic question. I love also the self-aware aspect. I was just in a class yesterday showing some slides from the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, that was their colonial museum. And I was also just there last summer, and I took a photo. They have like these, like on their walls as you walk in, they have these little placards, I guess. And the first kind of placard was this self-aware statement that this museum was created as a colonial museum to collect, show, and legitimize the colonial efforts of the Dutch government. So they're telling their audience that everything in here was collected with that purpose. And so that type of self-awareness of revealing what your history, what the foundation is, that's super important. Now, I mean, you can also get into the debates about, well, how effective is just having a statement on the wall, right? There's got to be some other things happening. But I think that self-awareness of revealing to your audience what you're doing. So showing that, the hand of the artist or the signature of the author, right? Revealing who is creating what you're seeing is really important, because it takes away that kind of naturalized well, it's just this way, or like it's just God-given, I guess, because it's here, right? When you don't have, when you're not told from what perspective, from whose perspective, who's the author here, when you don't have that, it can be easily just accepted. So it's great that self-awareness. Now, why does it matter that museums are going forward with a more trauma-informed approach? Museums, for me, museums matter because they have so much power. They have a staggering amount of power that I think that we should all be more aware of and concerned. If you think about it, these institutions have collected objects of the past, but they also are representing people's histories and culture, and in that, you have a tremendous amount of power. If you have the power to decide whose history gets collected, whose art gets collected, whose stories get to be told, and then you go and you put them in these temples to art, these temples, these buildings that really legitimize, kind of, and create these master narratives or official stories. That's a tremendous amount of power. And they've always had that power, and they've always used that power. And I mean, that's the beginning of museums. So if we get back to like the origin of museums, and after the Enlightenment, after revolutions, and we get into a period where we get like first public museums. So again, back like mid-19th century, we start having public museums. So all of these rulers, monarchy, very wealthy, elite people have amassed huge collections. And now they're opening them to select publics. Okay, it's going to be a long time before like you and I could just saunter into a museum without having to write like a formal letter of request or anything like that. However, the idea of turning these things over to the public was, it wasn't benign. There was a reason, right? There's a reason. And the reason was to educate the masses. Educate the masses and give the kind of illusion of power to the masses. So there's a great movement, after industrialization is happening, you have all of these workers with a little bit of free time. They're all living in these new cities. And, bosses don't want their workers to, unite against them, all of those things. So the days off when the church has lost a lot of its power, this comes out of the Enlightenment period, the church has lost some of its power. So, what are our workers going to do on their days off? We got to make sure that they're not just going to the pub, drinking, and complaining about their work, because then they might conspire against us and rise up against us. So maybe we should give them another alternative to spend their days doing. So this idea of giving them a form of spectacle or entertainment, but that also can educate, this type of disciplinary museum where we can train them in the taste of the elites. We can train them into identifying themselves as a particular nationality. So let's just say Britain. So we can show them what it means, what it looks like to be British. So they're also really powerful in their agenda of creating a national identity. So they're representing a shared history, their shared customs, all of these things. Museums are representing that. And so if you can see yourself within that and you relate to that, then you've created something new. You've created now a nation, a people, right? And that's really, those identities are hard to form, but they're purposeful, right? If you want to create a group around an identity, being able to construct that is really important. And thinking about who's constructing it and for why they're constructing it is also really essential. So the history of museums, why they were opened up and made public, was a lot of that. They wanted people to identify as British, not as the poor and the rich. They didn't want those class identifications to be the strongest thing. They didn't want religious identifications to be the strong thing. They wanted everyone to identify as a national identity. Because that creates social cohesion, right? But it also creates how do you see yourself from how do you see yourself from British versus French, right? What does that look like? Well, you have to have then a spectrum. To know I'm British, I have to know that I'm not South African, right? Or I have to know that I'm not American. So that is the reason why they're also displaying other cultures, particularly from their colonies, which is another big thing that I could talk about if you would like. Yeah.
Yeah, how would they display those people from other colonies?
Well, okay. So I should have said this from the start, that I'm speaking in generalities here, but it's the museums were used to legitimize colonization, and it's kind of a complex way. So if you think about Western tradition in art, or the dominant Judeo-Christian religious practices, if you go into, say, like Western Africa or the Pacific, other places that are not practicing those religions, that have different ways in which they record history, so it might be oral traditions. Their art has a different aesthetic. They might even call it art, right? Art is this concept that was created out of the Renaissance, but they're not working off of that same principle. But you have to look at a layer underneath that. In the West, they're also thinking, at this point, in the mid-19th century, they have like social Darwinism is their lens in which they're looking at. So they believe that the evidence of these quote-unquote barbarous or primitive societies, collect them, we can put that on this evolutionary scale, this progress. And of course, the British are going to put themselves at peak civilization. America, we're going to put ourselves peak civilization, the French peak civilization. But that lineage of going back and that thinking that the Pacific or sub-Saharan Africa, that those people and culture are in this kind of pre-civilized, quote-unquote, barbarous state. And it's not a case of biology, of course, right? It's cultural differences, but they're conflating those things. And that conflation matters because this is how museums are laid out. They're laid out to show this kind of evolutionary progress of thinking about people as trapped in a kind of a prehistoric past. And so even think about how that plays out then in the arrangement of galleries, right? One leads to the next. There's a natural progression. So this kind of mimics an evolutionary model. And it was like powerful propaganda to show those works or objects or customs or even people. People were displayed in what they called human zoos in a really kind of horrific way. There's a whole really horrific history about the display of human bodies and people made to perform their cultures in museums and exhibitionary spaces. So it's really intertwined. It's really problematic, but it served to show the average public in in Leiden and in Britain and in France that, see, you're French because you're not that. Look how different, right? And so it's creating a sense of difference. And all of this is based on the way in which things look. Museums are places to see and be seen. And so it relies so much on visual difference and visual similarities. You're not necessarily often brought into deeper context, cultural specificity, any of those things. If you think about like Michelangelo's David, that's what you think is, peak civilization, high art. And then anything that doesn't look like that, well, they must be totally backwards. They must not they're filling that in as using that as evidence of their quote unquote backwardness. See, they need us. Mm-hmm. They need our way of life. They need our religion. They need us to educate them because look, they can't make a David. Never mind that wasn't, they didn't want to, right? That's not their aesthetic tradition. That was not their prerogative. So these museums, they have historically had all of this power. And that element of that self-awareness that you brought up in the previous question, it's that self-awareness that museums, it still matters today. I think that museums could do a lot of good today just by telling that story, telling that origin story of museums, and that museums prime their visitors to just rely on sight. Right? Just rely on visual differences and similarities. Not everything can be ascertained from just visual similarities and differences.
Something else I find interesting when you were talking about the human zoos, this kind of popped into my brain. Yeah. But it's interesting that we can live through things that are grotesque, are ugly, but it takes things like these sculptures, which look like wacky animal-human hybrids. They look sad and they look...
Yeah.
But it's interesting that it takes something like that in order to make us kind of deal with it and acknowledge.
Yeah, so this is like the power of a lot of contemporary artists. But contemporary artists, they're getting into these histories, and they can use their art to signify back to that and play on it in certain ways and bring it back into dialogue today. That's what artists are they're very well equipped to do that, and to do it in provocative ways that kind of put the due diligence on their audience to find out, investigate why this looks this way, do a little digging here, try to unpack what these different connections are being made, the symbolism, all of these things that sometimes it's great absurdity that they're also pointing out. So contemporary artists can do a lot of things to raise awareness and bring attention to our past.
Can you go into that a little bit more with the specific Jane Alexander sculptures and displays and the kind of emotions that are provoked and maybe even how they're received by the audience?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how they were received by the audience. That's an area of study that I can't speak to. I don't know if anybody's actually done a study like that. But I can speak to what she's kind of working with here is that, it's very naturalistic, right? You can easily recognize those as human bodies, torsos, but once you get to the head, we're confronted with something that's not quite clear to us. There's animal horns. Their snouts kind of appear to be cut off. At least we can tell that their senses have been messed with here, right? Maybe there's a little bit of nasal cavities, ear holes, right? There's this cavity on the side of the guy in the middle's head. They appear to have undergone some type of harm, some type of real physical trauma, the scars going down their torsos, and then of course on their backs, they have parts of these vertebrae popping out. So Alexander's process, she would go and collect found bones out around Cape Town, or actually she was living in Johannesburg. So she would just go out in the fields and find discarded animal bones that had decayed out there. She used beeswax, all these other things. A part of my argument was that these casts, these male form casts, they're so casual and they're so kind of aloof. They appear almost bored, like they're waiting for something. And that, again, creates this tension of, well, you see such kind of traumatic wounds. You would expect somebody like, pulling their hair, like in anguish. They seem to be nonplussed, just like totally aloof that they are exposed in these ways, or perhaps they're transitioning between two species, right? It's unclear, and that's the point. It's supposed to be unclear. However, there's some connections that I was trying to make, in that the physical proportions, the naturalism here, does hearken to the Greco-Roman tradition. If you just, kind of ignore their heads, but you think about the physicality, the kind of accurate delineation of the toes and the muscles. I mean, this could be some, high Renaissance or all the way back Greco-Roman stuff, sculptures. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely speaking to that tradition. And that's the main tradition in Western culture, is classicism, right? And classicism is this kind of aesthetic hegemony that really rules everything. Like, if you're not in working within a classical tradition, you usually, within the study of art, you're on the periphery, you're lesser, you're not doing the like high rational, quote unquote, good art. So by her making those bodies grotesque, by her opening them up, making them unidentifiable, that's another really important aspect. I think that speaks generally to humanity, but also really kind of specifically to a South African context. You think about the really stratified racial categories that the government made people register as. So this idea of like, you have to go to the government and they're going to tell you if you're Black African, if you're colored, if you're, X, Y, and Z, all these other racial types. So this idea that you are, and what you get access to is just down to this kind of one identity. Here, we can't identify them, though, right? We don't know if they're fully human, are they beast? We don't have a word, right? They're beyond category. And in that way, they challenge us because, well, they're kind of like us, but they're kind of not. So we can kind of relate to them in some ways, but we can't in all the ways. So this idea of messing with of identities, showing that they're not a singular thing, or they're not necessarily even binary things, right? That once you kind of conclude on, no, okay, it's for sure. What's a bull and a man? What is that?
Minotaur?
Minotaur, yeah. Okay, we'll call them minotaurs, right? So. But then once you settle on that, and then you're like, well, no, it doesn't strictly go by what a minotaur is. So it undermines any type of classification, and so I think that can be a powerful statement about any claim to a singular of identity, right? This claiming of singular identity, but also within the art historical context, I think she's going right at this idea of making the aesthetic that has always been the tradition, that has always been kind of weaponized against people who have not practiced this Western classicizing tradition, that they've been deemed as lesser or barbarous or backwards or untalented, whatever it might be. She's literally kind of brutalizing that tradition, and she's making it ugly. She's showing that she's showing the classicized tradition as literally harmful, maybe, right? It kind of manifests as this like unruly beast that has caused a lot of harm and trauma and all these different things. So she's doing a lot here, but the point is to not grasp at it, just let it be all the things. Let it be this kind of fluid engagement of contemplating similarities and differences, and that our efforts to truly know something is maybe a fool's errand. Perhaps we should just accept the mystery, accept the wonder, accept the difference, and accept that maybe we don't have the right to know everything. Maybe I don't need to know. Maybe I don't need to access all of it, but I can still appreciate. I don't have to understand it to appreciate it, right? Or to accept it. So it's kind of, it's doing a lot. It's really pulling heavy duty, I think. I think it's fantastic, of course.
This topic has been really fascinating.
Thank you.
What are you looking forward to the future, research-wise?
Well, research-wise, I have an essay, or it's a book chapter. It's coming out should be coming out in spring 2025, so this spring. It's being published by Bergham Books. The book is called The Fabric of Anthropological Knowledge, Changing Perspectives in and Beyond Europe. And it's an edited volume, so I had given a presentation at the European Society of Anthropology. Anthropology is not my field, but again, I used a case study from my doctoral work that dealt with a different work of Jane Alexander's, and her my argument in that is that she's kind of quoting this ethnographic diorama that was in one of the South African museums, and she's again going back into the history, revealing the absurdities of all this. She has combinatory animals, all of this great stuff. And so I used her work as this touch point to tell that history of ethnographic displays, and particularly in dioramas. So that book chapter will be coming out, in spring. I am just starting this Friday. I'll just be starting a fellowship with the Archives of American Art, which is a Smithsonian institution, and I'm going to be one of several fellows who are going to be trained in provenance research. So I'm really excited. We haven't had our first meeting yet, but we'll be getting deep into the archives and doing detective work. Detective work, or learning how to do detective work of provenance research. And provenance research is really important, particularly right now. We have so much of museum activities right now is to identify the real owners, or where these objects actually came from, to do repatriation, rightful returns, all sorts of different things. This is a really important activity and skill set as well. So I'll start as a fellow. This week is our first meeting, and then I'll be implementing those in my classes. So if anybody's going to take museum studies classes in the future from me, we'll be doing some provenance work, and I'm really excited because it is kind of a really specialized thing, and I think it'll really make for some fun classes. Yeah, and I've always wanted to be a detective. So, yeah, I know. So this is like scratching that itch that I was like, wanted to be a detective.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nygaard.
Thank you.
To learn more about her work, you can find her on the St. Paul campus of the University of St. Thomas. The Professor Podcast is brought to you by the St. Thomas Libraries and made possible with the funding from the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm your host, Sarah Brings. The producers and library staff are Mary Davidson and Andrea Kepi. Thank you so much to our guests and to you, our listeners.